So my friends, this is the most amazing book in the world, but there's a problem with this book. It's very hard to understand. We don't know where to start when we read the Bible. We don't know how to make sense of it. We don't know what natural breaks there are in sections and what we're supposed to do with it. So we just feel like we're inadequate and we can't put things together in the Word. And beyond that, we can't even apply it to our lives, because how are we supposed to do that while we're highlighting everything and we still don't know what it means? We don't know how to interpret the Bible. We don't know how to understand this ancient text. But today, if you give me 20 minutes of your time, I promise you that I will shed a new light on the Bible. I will help you understand where you are in the Bible, what the purpose of that part of the Bible is, and how to apply what you're reading. I guarantee you this is going to be one of the most important 20 minutes of your life. This is from a message that I heard, and I've changed it around a little bit just to make it a little easier to understand. But before we get into how to do this, how to understand and break the Bible into manageable sections and to take that macro look over the Bible, let's talk some numbers. So first, there's one Bible, right? There's two testaments broken up into the New and the Old Testament. There are 6 sections, and that's what we're going to talk about today. 3 in the Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament, and it was written by 40 authors. There's 66 separate books, and it was written over the span of 1,600 years. And this is what I want you to know about the Bible. And this is something that you would say, it doesn't make sense. The Bible is the most modern book. The Bible is the most modern book. You would say, well, how is that so if it was written, thousands of years ago? Because the author is still alive today. Did you know that the Bible is just as true as it was when it was written? There's a false notion that a book as ancient as the Bible can't speak to modern needs, can't speak to where we are today, because, in those times they didn't have computers, they didn't have social media, they didn't have these things. But this is what the Bible has to say about that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." It's funny, we live in this such a short period of life, in this grand scheme of history, and we think that just because something's new to us, that it hasn't been there before. But the Bible says it's just a reoccurring cycle. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. The wind picks up, the wind dies down. After the flood, God said that those things will never change. So we have to understand that, then this is important, that we have as humans this unquenchable thirst for something new. But what you really need is something true. If it's new, friends, it's probably not true. If you're listening to the latest pop psychology, you're going to be moved by the wind and the waves, because there's nothing solid that you're basing your life on. The Bible is the only book that is unshakable. And why is that? It's withstood the test of time. It's the most intensely scrutinized book, and yet it still stands today. You see on the news channels, a house will burn down, and the only thing that didn't burn was the Bible, because God has His hand on His Word. God is protecting His Word, and His Word is never going to die. It will continue for eternity. When you hold the Bible in your hands, you're holding a miracle in your hands. The Bible has withstood all of those things, and yet it's the #1 best-selling book of all time. Think about that. There's no other book that has sold more than the Bible, and the Bible is in more languages and translations than any other book. That's why it's so important. But why is the Bible so special? Why should I care about the Bible? Why should I even read the Bible? Well, it sheds light on human nature. It tells us about why we do what we do. It talks about the world's problems and human sufferings. But most importantly, it reveals the way to God. And the Bible also answers some of the most pressing questions that we all have when we're born. Like, where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I on earth? Why in the world am I here? And what's the purpose of my existence? The Bible also helps us to get to know our Creator. And when we get to know our Creator, that in turn helps us to understand ourselves. So I'm going to help you break down the Bible in a way that maybe you've never seen before. So get out a piece of paper. On one side, it's going to represent the Old Testament, and you're going to draw 3 boxes. On the other side of the paper, you're going to draw 3 boxes which represent the New Testament. Now that first box in the Old Testament that you drew is called the foundational section. Why is it called the foundational section? Well, it's the first 5 books of the Bible. These are called the books of the law or the books of Moses. This is from Genesis to Deuteronomy. So you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the purpose of all these books, they show God's principles, His promises, and His goals. So basically, God is revealing His law. This is how He reveals Himself to the world. So it tells you who He is, how He reveals Himself, what His nature and character is. And the question, here's the cool part, I'm going to teach you how to study each of these sections and what your focus should be. So if you find yourself studying anywhere in these first 5 books and you're reading any part of that section, you ask yourself one question, and that is, what is God like? What is God like? Because this is the part where He's starting to reveal things about the world, things about you, things about Himself. And our number one priority in Bible study isn't to figure out who you are, it's to find out who God is. Because if you find out who He is, then you can find out more about yourself. We start at the wrong starting point. So the second section, that next little box right under the foundational one, is the historical section. Now, the foundational had 5 books in it. The historical section has 12 books, and it starts in Joshua and it ends in Esther. So what does this section show us? Well, it shows how people applied or didn't apply the foundational principles. So it's basically a bunch of people who took what God revealed in the foundational section and they're just living it out. Some people did really well, some people didn't do very well. But the cool part about the Bible is we get to open up the curtain and we get to see what people did with what God showed them. And because of that, now we get to benefit from it. You know, the Bible wasn't written to you, but it was written for you. So now what you can do is you could say, you know what? Look at how Joshua did that. I want to try to do that. Look at how this person failed. I want to avoid that, because God is showing us how to live our lives. So people did well, people did poorly in this historical section. So what's the question when you're reading any book in this section from Joshua to Esther? It's this: what does God like? What does God like? So when we shape our lives, we want to shape it around the things that God likes. Now the third box, right under that historical box, is the instructional one. And this is 22 books. This is really, really big. This is from Job all the way to Malachi. So in this section, you have 5 books that are poetical books, and you have 17 prophetical books. So the poetical books, starting in Job, reflect the hearts of the people, just like us. If you're having a tough day, if you don't know why certain things are happening or why the wicked are prospering, you know, all those kind of things, this is the book for you. This is where you get in tune with God's heart. And then you've got the prophetical books. Now, what was the point of a prophet? God only raised up a prophet when He needed to encourage or correct people. So that's exactly what this section is. This section shows how well they lived out the original principles, and it's further teaching on that historical section. So it basically isn't a furtherance of history. History stopped in the Old Testament, Esther, but starting in Job, it's teaching on that. It's basically saying, you know, this is what they did right, and this is what I want you to do because of it. So it's teaching, it's encouraging, it's correcting. You know, it's like God is a shepherd. Sometimes He encourages us, and sometimes He needs to prod us to go forward. And that's what these instructional books are doing for us. It doesn't further the historical section, but the question that you need to ask if you find yourself between Job and Malachi is this: how can I be more God-like? How can I be more God-like? And this section will teach that. Now let's move over into the New Testament. You have your 3 boxes. The first section, remember, was the foundational section. That was the first 5 books. Then we went down to the historical section, which was 12 books. And now we went down to the instructional section, which was 22 books. Here's the cool part about the New Testament. It exactly mirrors the Old Testament. Some people say that God is like one kind of way in the Old Testament, like He's really angry, and then the New Testament He kind of gets a little softer because, you know, everyone was pissed off before. But the crazy part is He's the same God. So the first, check this out, in the New Testament, all you have to remember, is 3 sections: foundational, historical, instructional, because the New Testament is the same exact way. So that first box at the top is foundational. It's the first 4 books of the Bible, and that's also known as the Gospels. That's Matthew through John. And if you find yourself in this section, the whole purpose of it is it shows the life of Christ, his teachings, and his commandments. So in the Old Testament, you had the first 5 books, which are known as the law. In the New Testament, you have the first 4 books, which is based on God's grace, on Jesus Christ and his life. Remember, he was the perfect reflection of the Father. So if you're in this section of the Bible, the first 4 books in the New Testament, you're going to ask yourself, what is Jesus Christ like? Remember, in the first part, you asked, what is God like? But now we're taking the focus and putting it on Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was also God, but he was also man. He came to show us who the Father was. The next section below that is, take a guess, the historical section. Instead of 12 books in the Old Testament, the historical section in the New Testament only has 1 book, and that is the book of Acts. So the foundational section, if you look in the book of John, the last thing that was really talked about in John was the Great Commission, where God said, go and make disciples of all nations, teach them my ways. So what was the historical section? Well, it was the beginning of that mission and the church. So what you're watching is how the disciples applied the teachings of Jesus. And that's the whole purpose of Acts. You're trying to watch how these early believers and these early followers applied those teachings. Some of them did really well, some of them didn't. But either way, we can learn from either their, examples or their mistakes. Now that last box at the bottom, this is exactly how many books as the Old Testament section had. This is the instructional section. Now this is from Romans all the way to Revelation, 22 books. And these are 22 letters. So basically they're not written to you. Remember, I told you that before. They're not written to you, but they're written for you. And these letters are to encourage and correct. Remember, the first section is the law. The second part is how they followed it. They did really well. They didn't do really well. And that last part is instructing on what they did. And it's such an amazing gift that we have this Bible, because God is not a God that wants you to be in the dark and not understand his will. He wants you to unfold the pages so you can understand how he wants you to live. The only problem is you won't know God's will unless you get in his word. This last instructional section shows how well the first followers of Jesus lived out his principles. And if you find yourself in this section, you'll ask yourself this question: how can I become more Christ-like? Today I had someone share with me that they were reading in the book of James. And so I had shown them my message today, and I said, okay, when you're reading the book of James, what's the whole purpose of James? What's the purpose of that section? And what are you looking for when you read it? And she was able to look back at this little outline, these 6 sections, and say, oh, it makes sense. I'm going to be seeing how the first followers of Jesus lived out the principles that he shared, and I'm going to be learning how to become more Christ-like. I said, yes, you nailed it. So to reflect on today's message, how do I make sense of the Bible? Well, first, you have to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1 is, what one of these 6 sections am I in? So the first thing that you need to do is locate the section. So James, for instance, is in the instructional section of the New Testament. So what about Genesis? Well, Genesis, remember, is in that first foundational box, and that's where we're figuring out what God is like. So pretty much when you're reading Genesis, you're just circling all the attributes of God. God created, God spoke, God said, God blessed. You're trying to circle all those things about God. So wherever section you find yourself in, you have to first say, what section am I in? And then point that out. The second thing that you do is you try to identify the purpose of that section. Remember, the purpose of that first foundational section, if you're reading Genesis, is to show God's principles, promises, and goals. The third step and the third question is, what's the question I'm trying to answer with my study? What's the whole point of reading the section that I'm in right now? If you don't know that, you're going to fumble, you're going to feel lost, you're going to throw your Bible away, you're not going to want to read it again because you're saying, I don't even know how to live this out. But the cool part is, through these 6 sections, you'll be able to not only identify where you are in the Word or define the section, but you'll be able to apply that to your life. So go ahead and try this out. Try this little map, this little formula out with these 6 sections, and I guarantee you, God will help you understand His Word in a brand new way. God bless you.